Good morning, everyone. If I can, yep, all the videos are coming back on. Good, and they have worked. That is perfect. Thank you. So I will we'll just give it a few seconds because I can see that the participants are still being pulled through onto Zoom. And for anyone who is watching it live on YouTube, welcome to you as well. Okay, so thank you very much for joining us this morning. We were very oversubscribed. As ever with webinars, I think people do have a little bit of Zoom fatigue, so we tend to find out it does take a few minutes for people to actually kind of click on, join, etc. But I can see the numbers are ratcheting up, which is great. So you are here today to hear about the budget. We're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the what next. I imagine that might involve a little bit of what was missing in Wednesday's delivery. I think 48 hours after the event is just about the perfect moment to talk about this. So we've had the Rishi spin. We know what the government wants us to think about the budget, but we've also now, 2 days later, had people like those who are on the panel today, amongst others, picking over for you the small print, the individual spending lines, those places where something's been tucked away that wasn't quite announced at the dispatch box. And so that means we can have a slightly more honest, to use the Chancellor's phrase, discussion today about what the budget actually means. I'm delighted, as I say, to be joined by three such expert panelists this morning. None of them need any intro. They are often on our TV screens, obviously in the media, and talking about these topics. But we have David Gauke, who obviously former Secretary of State in various positions, including work and pensions, which obviously is particularly relevant as well at the moment with unemployment, etc. And of course, as Chief Secretary to the Treasury, so has been in there and will have had this experience several times over. I don't know whether you get a sort of nervous sense for your former colleagues at these moments, or just a deep relief that it's not you and that you're not going to have to deal with any fallout. We, of course, also have Miata Fambula, who is the Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation and was on Newsnight talking about this very topic last night, which is great. And we have David Smith, who, again, no introduction needed, but is the economics editor at the Sunday Times. And I highly recommend his weekly columns, which are always really fascinating and genuinely informative. So thank you, all three of you, for joining us this morning for what I hope will be a lively and interesting discussion. Thank you, everyone, as I mentioned at the start, but for those of you who are a little bit late coming through, for also giving up an hour this morning to hear the discussion. I will in a second just explain the sort of logistics and how you can ask questions, etc. But just as a little bit of context, so you will all remember that the Chancellor, of course, announced the date of his budget back in mid-December. The world actually did look a bit different. It might not feel like it, but it did look a bit different back then. We hadn't yet gone into a third lockdown, so none of the forecasts and the projections we'd seen had taken into account what was a very virulent mutant strain that then obviously has put us back down to the lockdown we are still in today. Equally, whilst we had the very encouraging MHRA authorization of the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, I don't think any of us could have expected that we would be where we are on the vaccine rollout, which has been remarkable. So when the Chancellor actually stood up at the dispatch box on Wednesday, that meant there was quite a dramatically different set of forecasts from the OBR in terms of where the economy is going. Some very much positive news linked to, I think, that vaccine rollout, so a faster recovery by about 6 months. And I think particularly encouragingly, though we certainly shouldn't be getting in any way complacent about it, much lower projections for unemployment, which, you know, I think most of us were expecting to see a lot higher rates, which obviously has such a devastating, not just economic, but human cost. So we're expecting a peak of around 6.5% rather than almost 12% that was previously forecast. So some good news. We also obviously had the updates to the projections for debt and deficit with the prediction that the borrowing rate, so the deficit, will be down below 3% by 2025-26, which, if you think about where we're borrowing at the moment, is obviously a big drop. I'm sure we might have some discussion about that today and whether that is the right or wrong thing in terms of generating growth. And then, of course, the Chancellor set out 3 key objectives, which we will go through in turn this morning. The first was to protect the economy and particularly jobs, which has been the mantra of the government throughout this crisis. And we saw the extension of lots of COVID measures to do that. The second was, in his words, to protect the country against future shocks by putting the public finances, or starting to put the public finances back on track. And the final one's to set the foundation of a future economy. And I think we could have a discussion about whether it's still clear exactly what that future economy is going to look like, or rather what the government wants it to look like, and also whether the measures are sufficient for achieving that. But they were the 3 objectives. We also had 3 fiscal principles that we might touch on, though no fiscal rules as yet. So I said I would explain briefly the logistics. So I am going to have the great pleasure of being able to start by asking lots of questions to our panelists, but then I will, of course, open it up to the floor being both those of you who are in Zoom, if I can put it that way. Please do use the Q&A function to ask any questions that you have, and I will do my best to put those to panelists. Equally, if you are watching this via YouTube, please tweet at us your questions. So tweet at Reform Think Tank, and someone will send me those questions so that I can also hopefully factor those in. So I will stop now. None of you came to actually listen to me, but hopefully that's a little bit of context. I said to my panelists, and given that it is the title of the event today, that I would start by putting them slightly on the spot and say, what is the best and what is the worst measure that was contained in the budget? So I'm going to go through each of our panelists and ask that question, and then we can open up into a broader discussion. So David Gork, can I start with you? Best and worst measure?
Well, I think we're looking at the best measure. I would probably go for the visa reforms. I think that's very sensible, liberalising that. I mean, if you're looking more generally, the best aspect of it is no doubt we'll discuss this in greater detail, as I think he made the broad fiscal judgments right, which is to keep spending now. I think taxes will need to go up. And I don't think there's an imperative for him to have taken action, an economic imperative for him to have taken action this week. But politically, this was his best opportunity to announce something that happened down the line. So I think he got his fiscal judgment about right. If we're looking at a measure, I like the visa stuff. The worst bit, well, look, I do think taxes are going to have to go up, but I think it was the wrong choice. Going with corporation tax, I think in the long term, if we want to attract business investment here, I think corporation tax is an important lever. It's not the biggest driver for decisions for international investors, multinational companies, but it is a lever that the Chancellor can control. As I was saying earlier, I'm trying not to take it too personally as the Treasury Minister who reduced corporation tax, and so there's a slight sense of sort of 6 years hard work down the drain. But I do think that, you know, more generally, if you look at a measure that is not going to be helpful in terms of an open for business message. So I have to say on that very big measure, I don't like it.
Which is, I mean, a very large share of the way that the Chancellor is getting back to some direction, back to black anyway. Miata, can I come to you next for your best and your worst measure?
Yeah, so my best measure is something that's sort of tucked in the budget, which is the government looks like it is about to change the Bank of England's mandate to include climate objectives. That is huge. If they do that, which is something that we've been calling for and advocating, that is a massive move and will have a huge impact on the ability of the Bank of England to gear the financial markets towards green investment. And it's probably, in terms of the kind of green package, the single biggest thing that was done in the budget. He only mentioned it briefly. The devil will be in the detail. So we're all on this to make sure it's as ambitious as it could be, but it's a real opportunity if the Treasury get this right. So that's definitely my best measure. I think my worst measure is the £20 uplift to universal credit. So good that it was extended. I think that was the right decision. But I think it was the wrong decision to only extend it for 6 months for 2 reasons. The uplift to UC only accounts for half of the cuts to Social Security since 2010. And it is going to end at the very time that unemployment will be rising. It's not going to be OBR is not projecting mass unemployment, but unemployment is going up. And we are also expecting a massive income squeeze. So the OBR are projecting that by 2025, wages will have been no higher than 2008. So nearly 20 years in which wages have flatlined, 20 years in which we've had a squeeze in living standards. And the fact that that wasn't reflected in the budget, I think, was a massive missed political judgment. And I definitely hope that that's something the Chancellor comes back to.
And interesting, and perhaps we'll come back to this, but interesting that the UC seemed to be about the only thing that has a cliff edge, whereas all the other COVID measures that were extended seem to have been sort of phased out in some way. But that is very much at the exact point furlough ends, so does the UC uplift, when I think that's about the time, as you were saying, we expect to see, what was it, about 300,000, which seems a very conservative estimate, but 300,000 more people become unemployed. So thank you very much. And David Smith, your best and worst, please.
Yes, thank you, Charlotte. The best and most innovative measure, I think, in the budget was the super deduction, 130% super deduction for business investment. UK has long had a problem of insufficient business investment, in spite of those corporation tax cuts that David helped to steer through. And this, about a year ago, I wrote about the idea of full expensing of business investment, which is 100% write-off against tax. This is 130%. The unfortunate thing about it is it's only temporary. And I think it's there as much as a political expedient as an economic measure. In other words, the announcement of the corporation tax increase, while sensibly delayed, might have persuaded companies to reduce business investment. So this boosts it. It only boosts it for a year or so before the super deduction is removed. So I would like to see something permanent evolve out of this, maybe full expensing, not the 130%. But I think that was the best measure. Worst measure, and I'll name two, were the two measures that affected the demand side of the housing market without doing anything for the supply side. So, there was a case just about last summer for the stamp duty reduction. The housing market was shut down completely in the first lockdown. It looked as though transactions were coming off the boil quite sharply. A lot of the house builders had stopped work on new sites. They were just completing what they'd started. So there was a case for it then. I think there's very little case for extending it and extending it through to September. We know that the effect of the stamp duty reduction has been to boost house prices, fastest rate of growth of house prices since pre-Brexit referendum. And then you tie that with the mortgage guarantee, so people will be able to get mortgages on 5% deposits again. I think that is, you need a balanced housing package, which affects the supply side as well as the demand side. Those things are purely demand measures, quite populist measures, I think. And so I would mark those down quite heavily, I think.
Great, thank you. And I'm delighted we send out an email, which everyone should subscribe to if they don't already get it, after each fiscal event, and we do our good for, bad for. And I'm pleased to say most of those match with what we had put in. So that is great. Not done deliberately. I didn't choose just people who would agree. So that is fantastic context. And actually, interestingly, all three of you have chosen as your best, perhaps unsurprisingly, but worth noting, as things which should help drive growth, and growth that meets objectives that we might have. So I'm thinking particularly in Miata's case, kind of driving green growth so that we can reach the net zero and achieve what the government set out, but all kind of focused on sort of more of the long-term growth agenda. So I'm going to come back to that. I do just want to spend just a few moments reflecting on the extension of the COVID measures specifically. Now, I think by a lot of people's accounts, the Chancellor went a bit further than we expected with the length of time that he's extended, for example, furlough, and also the VAT cuts and various other measures. What is the view in terms of whether that is enough? And also, one of the things that was observed in the smaller print was the fact that no money has been set aside for sort of ongoing COVID related costs. So we've got money in for sort of, this coming fiscal year, but, if we need an annual vaccine program, if we need to continue test and trace, we have courts backlogs, we have school catch up, nothing at the moment seems to have been put in place for what are still sort of COVID related, COVID fallout, but we assume will need to be there, but the public finances aren't accounting for. Perhaps, Miata, I could come to you first of all on is it enough on the sort of most direct measures, and then those indirect things, should we be concerned about that?
Yeah, really good question. So, I mean, I think on short-term emergency measures was the strongest piece for me in the budget. I think on this, the Chancellor's judgment was broadly right. I think it was right that, for example, he extended furlough until September. If he hadn't have done that, our analysis suggests 2.7 million jobs would have been lost. So that was the strongest point. Is it enough? So the big gamble is come July, this is all over. We never have to think about COVID ever again. I desperately hope that's where we are. I doubt it will be where we are, because I think even if we're flight of foot with new mutations, there will still have to be some control and measures in the system. I don't think we factored that in. On the economic side, so you take something like furlough, we know even after we open up, there will be certain sectors that are going to be struggling. And if we look over to other countries, so China, even after they completely opened up, we know that social sectors, hospitality, retail, they struggled to rebound to full capacity and complement. So I think there has to be some give for transition. And what I would really like is to see something like furlough transition to something a bit akin to the government's job support scheme, if we can keep up, but that version of kind of part-time, part work, and we would say part training, in order to allow us to transition sectors. So aviation is the classic example. The aviation sector is going to be hit for a while. What are you doing with all those workers? You can't just stop it because you suddenly have a whole lot of people being thrown into a labour market that's not creating jobs quick enough. So we need to think, we talk the language of just transition. And if we want to do that and, avoid some of the mistakes that were made in the past, then you need to find a pathway to help people get trained up, keep them engaged in the labour market, which is what the job support scheme would have done, and then transition them to other jobs that have been created. So the piece that's missing is like what comes after September. You need something. That was a lesson Germany took after the financial crisis. They kept their version of furlough going, scaled it down, but kept it going, and then used it for particular sectors and then ramped it up come the pandemic. And we need to be thinking about something similar. And then a big training component in that, because we've got to train people up from certain sectors into other sectors.
And David Smith, that idea that we're only going to see, I say only, but only see a few 100,000. I think it was 300,000. The OBR is thinking will be the uptick additionally on the unemployment. Does that sound realistic, given where businesses, some businesses, yes, furlough helps, the various initiatives like business rates, but not all businesses that are going to have to be shut will have had that rateable value low enough to have got the business rates completely separated. Is that a rather optimistic view of what we might see happen in terms of business failure and therefore unemployment come end of furlough?
Yeah, it's fair. I mean, there were nearly 5 million people on 5 million employments, as HMRC calls them, on furlough at the end of January, and the range has been from roughly 9 million at the peak, which was back last year, to just over 2 million in the early autumn. So how many of those will find their way back into work? I think that is a big question. I mean, if it is, there is a question mark attached to the 6.5%, as you say. If the unemployment peak is 6.5%, that would be an extraordinary achievement. I wrote quite early on in the pandemic that keeping unemployment below 3 million after a recession and a shock of the sort we've had would be a massive achievement. It would be a much lower peak, as you know, than after any recent recession, including the financial crisis recession. I think I agree very much with what's been said about support, and I think the Treasury the Treasury and HMRC worked wonders in launching the job retention scheme last spring. And if you remember, it was only supposed to last for 3 months, March to May. and then gradually extended. I think one thing that they haven't done during the interim period, probably because they didn't expect further lockdowns. I mean, we know last summer that the Treasury didn't expect a second and third lockdown because they were already thinking ahead to the November budget that didn't happen, and ETAP to help out and all those things. But I think it could and should have been refined to more selective sector support. You know, the sectors, like the travel sector, as has been mentioned, like hospitality, you have to make sure that other employers aren't just free riding on the scheme, and you have to ensure that it is properly targeted. And while it has been extended, and I think the extension was necessary, I don't think it is a very well targeted scheme at the moment. So that I think has been the drawback of trying to sort of make policy on the hoof. But as I say, if the unemployment peak is as low as 6.5%, that would be an amazing achievement, I think. And there are risks to that, and the risks are mainly on the upside.
Yeah, I think Paul Johnson of the IFS said it would be a triumph if we managed to keep unemployment at that level. And David Gauke, just, I mean, you may have reflections on the furlough and unemployment question, but I guess particularly on the sort of long tail of COVID impacts and the fact that public services are going to be reverberating with the consequences of what we've experienced for some time yet, and yet it doesn't appear that any funding has been put in place to pick up some of those costs. I mean, how realistic does that sound to you?
Not terribly, and it's the thing that would worry me most if I was still back in the Treasury. And I think it's been apparent, for a long time that there would be a long tail in terms of, that the public finance would suffer from long COVID, not so much because of scarring of the tax capacity, but more because the pressure on public spending is going to be so immense. So, we know that the NHS is going to have to look again at building up its resilience so that it can cope for future pandemics. We know that there's going to be an issue in terms of a backlog of operations, diagnostic issues, all sorts of things. We know that we're going to have issues in terms of mental health. Now, the government has put aside some money for that, but I suspect it's not going to be sufficient. We know that there's a catch-up job to be done on education. We know, going back to my last department, courts, we've got an issue there in terms of the criminal justice system. And I think the public mood in terms of the generosity of our welfare system has also changed, and that becomes very expensive very easily. So all of those are substantial pressures, which is why, if you like, coming back to the big fiscal judgment, I'm afraid it was going to have to be taxes that were going to bear the burden. Taxes had to go up. And on the face of it, if the target is simply just to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio, with improved levels of growth and so on, the Chancellor has done that in this budget. But the reality, I suspect, is that he's not going to be able to hold public spending levels at the levels that he has set out in the numbers this week. And as a consequence, unless growth exceeds what we anticipate, or what the ABR anticipates, or he's prepared to let the debt to GDP ratio grow further, then it seems to me that there may well be further tax rises to come.
And I want to move then on to that question about whether enough has been done or too much has been done in terms of the sort of fiscal tightening and the objective to try and get the public finances back on track in order to withstand any future shock where we might have to heaven forbid do something similar. But just to reflect on that question about kind of austerity, or which has become a sort of fairly dirty word now, but the idea of, is it going to be and does it have to be principally by taxes? I mean, one of the areas that people have pointed out that the Chancellor was a little bit sneaky on was not kind of telling us that actually there is a further cut, 4 billion, which is actually pretty small in the grand scheme of how much we spend in total on public services, but bearing in mind that's 4 billion out of the unprotected departments, and those were departments that were hit particularly hard over the last 10 years. We are going to see some money taken out. That, coupled with the fact that there hasn't been additional funding beyond the next year for any knock-on impacts around backlogs and kind of those sorts of consequences. And there was nothing about social care, which we might suggest could possibly need a bit more money in the future, not to mention rising demand in the NHS. So I guess my question, if there is a sort of a slightly a question in there, is how well do we think the Treasury, the government more broadly, the Chancellor is doing on trying to balance the fact that, you know, as David, you just mentioned, there is going to have to be some increases in spending just to meet demand, never mind to improve services, to meet some of the commitments that government has made in terms of improving those services in particular areas, etc., social care and what have you. How far do we think this kind of fiscal tightening approach is actually the right approach right now? And should we be concerned about borrowing? Is this the right time to be concerned about borrowing? Or should indeed the Chancellor, when he said, I'm not going to put any dates on my fiscal principles, have sort of pushed out even further any idea of doing something now? David, perhaps I can come straight back to you and then Miata and David.
Well, I think in terms of, if we're purely looking at the economics, the focus is about getting the economy moving. We're not under the same sort of pressures that we were in 2010 in terms of interest rates and the sort of jitteriness of the market, and we're earlier in the process as well. This is a quarter in which the economy is shrinking, so he doesn't have to do the fiscal consolidation announcements even now, but now is his best political opportunity. Now it's earlier in the Parliament, so there'll be less political pushback. The Conservative Party is riding high in the polls. There's a vaccine bounce, so they're in a strong political position, and he's giving away a lot of stuff at the same time. So, coming back to the corporation tax increase, he's also got the super deduction at the same time. So it's temporary. But it softens the blow and sugars the pill and all of that. So it's a sort of easier time for him to take action. I suspect, as I say, that if his target down the line is to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio, given the spending pressures, he'll kind of have to come back. But I think it's understandable why he would take some action now by way of announcements for tax increases in a couple of years hence.
And just very briefly, what will be the taxes if bearing in mind the manifesto commitment, would you expect they're going to have to break that? Is that the answer?
Well, they're very, they're just, I think they could have broken the manifesto commitment. I think it was a bad commitment. To be fair, it was a bad commitment when I was a Treasury Minister and defending it, but it's an even worse commitment now, I think. And I think circumstances have moved on so dramatically that they would have been entitled to say, look, sorry, we really, we are going to have to raise additional revenue. I think the public would have understood that. But they seem pretty determined. I mean, it depends what happens. If it's a relatively small number they need to find, they'll cast around and they'll look at CGT and whether there's something more they can do with property tax, which certainly could be reformed. There's talk of online sales tax, etc., etc. They might be able to find bits and pieces, carbon taxes, for example. They might be able to get there. I've generally been of the view, and this I think is what they should have done. If you want to raise substantial sums of money, there are three taxes that bring in 2/3 of government revenue: income tax, NICs, and VAT. You've really got to use those big levers if you want big sums of money. You can do that in a way which is progressive. You can do that in a way which is relatively economically efficient. And I think that's what he should have done. But they seem pretty resistant, and that will get harder as you get through the Parliament. So maybe those rates will stay as they are.
Thank you. And Miata, kind of general view on the sort of desire to get borrowing under control and as David was saying, the GDP to debt ratio.
Yeah, so I mean, two things to say. So the 4 billion cuts is on top of 10 to 12 billion that was penciled in at autumn statements. So 10 billion cut this year, 14 billion subsequent years. So I'm really struggling with the combination of cuts and tax rises to pay down the deficit. I just don't understand the economic rationale for it, particularly when you allow, if you think about this budget, most of the spending was on short-term measures. Very little investment into the long term, not for business, but not even for public services. Social care absent, the pressure on NHS absent, education absent, and then cuts to unprotected departments in order to pay down the deficit. And why I struggle with this is for two reasons. One, what matters is not the overall size of the deficit, but the cost of financing it. And this year, the cost of financing it is 13 billion less than it was before the crisis, because interest rates are so low. The second factor is the Bank of England have done a level of monetary fiscal coordination we've never seen before. They've stepped in to essentially buy up government debt. So over the course of the last year, the Bank of England, through the secondary market, has literally lent the government 92% of the borrowing it's done over the course of the pandemic. The Bank of England can be a patient creditor. The Bank of England has the option to think about creating facilities, which means that it can lock in interest rates in the long term, which means we have time. We have time to pay down the deficit. And the argument that if interest rates rise, it will mean a massive, it just doesn't bear out by the economics. And so for me, we know that if we can get the economy growing, we know if we can increase tax receipt, that will bear down on the deficit. And I don't understand, with all the other pressures, why you're choosing, for example, not to bolster social security, given the fact that we're having 20 years in which wages have been stagnant, hitting those at the bottom end more, when you know you've got big pressures on social care, on the health service. Why are you not prioritizing tax rises, which I agree have to be part of the complement, not to invest in those things, but to rush to pay down the deficit within 5 years? Makes no sense, which is why I think it's political and it's not economics. It's not based on economic necessity. It's based on a combination of, I think, political ideology, I don't know, and political tactics. But that's the wrong call. It's the wrong call for the country.
David Smith, is that, I mean, we do know borrowing levels are incredibly cheap at the moment, which is also partly why the Chancellor, in his own fiscal principles, said we should keep borrowing for capital investment. I mean, that was part of his rationale for doing so. Should we be concerned about closing the deficit and then tackling the debt now, or at least within this Parliament, or is it something that we could have left longer?
You can't put it off forever, and this year, as Miata says, has been exceptional. The Bank of England has done 450 billion of QE, which is more in the space of 12 months than it had done in the previous 11 years, and that has helped. I mean, the Chancellor was obviously quite concerned about debt interest, and in particular, maybe it won't happen, but the debt. Government debt is now very sensitive to short-term interest rates because of QE. Is more sensitive to short-term interest rates than long-term market gilt yields. So that is an issue, and you wouldn't want a situation where the Bank of England is constrained from ever raising bank rate above 0.1% because of that factor, because of its effect on the public finances. So I think there is an issue there. I think it was right to delay, to take advantage of the fact that borrowing is currently very cheap and likely to remain so for a year or so, but then to act. And in my experience, it doesn't take much, and we're seeing it already with the 1% pay award to the NHS staff, that it doesn't take much before people start to think that austerity is back, and I remember people talking about austerity even in the period, even in the 2000s, when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were providing the biggest sustained increase in public spending on record, 7% annual real growth in NHS spending and so on. So people are easily persuaded by that. But I also think that the budget was quite, David has told us what he thinks about corporation tax. And I have a lot of sympathy with that, because in many ways, the tax increases are very timid. They stuck to the manifesto commitment. I don't think the world has changed since December 2019. I think the tax priorities could have changed timidity, you can't even raise fuel duty, in the year in which the UK is hosting COP26. Timidity in respect to the fact that I think there was a kind of, David will be familiar with this phrase, we're all in it together, but I think there was a kind of we're all in it together spirit at the moment. I think if you tell people, you've seen this fantastic support, you've seen what the NHS has done, you might have to pay a bit more tax beyond freezing allowances, call it a kind of equivalent of a solidarity tax or something. People might have been prepared to do that. And I think there was a lack of imagination, just loading it all onto corporation tax, loading it onto freezing allowances, which is not a very, which is not a sustainable long-term policy, I don't think. So I think it could have been more imaginative. Now, maybe that, the dogs that didn't bark, like capital gains tax, like higher rate pension relief, we'll see more of those. Well, when the Chancellor unveils his reform plans, and we're promised this tax day on March the 23rd. I don't know what that will consist of, but I think it could have been more complete in a way, and it could have built on what I think is a public willingness to see the NHS better funded in the long term, all those things. Whereas I think it would be quite easy for this to glide into austerity Mark II, even if it's different from post 2010.
And just before I move on to the longer term vision for the economy and how we do get growth, Miata, just a reflection, if you wouldn't mind, on this question about taxes, and perhaps it was a bit timid. I mean, David Gauke mentioned the kind of, I mean, we've had a lot of mention of wealth here and assets, and so David Gauke, you mentioned property taxes, which is obviously one of the biggest sources of wealth in the country. David Smith mentioned capital gains there, and there was a lot of rumours, and obviously we had the Office for Tax Simplification's report on equalising capital gains. I mean, is it too timid? Should we actually be looking to be more creative in terms of tax increases in order to be able to fund the sorts of public services that we're seeing the public calling for?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think, politicians are terrified of talking about tax for good reason, but I think we generally need an honest debate. My view is that actually corporation tax, I know, David, you're instrumental in pushing it down, but at 19%, it was lower than it needed to be to incentivize companies to come here. And I could never understand us pushing corporation tax so low at the same time as we're stripping away welfare payments. Like, I just couldn't understand the rationale for that. So I think actually rebalancing and, increasing it, it's still going to be competitive. It's still going to be amongst the lowest levels amongst advanced economies is absolutely fine. I think we need to look at wealth taxes as well. I think we need to think about the structure of income tax. But I think a conversation with the public that says we're doing this in order to pay for a better social settlement is something the public would buy. Everyone has seen the vaccine rollout is a consequence of having a world-class NHS system. We're beating the rest of the world because we have an NHS that can do that. And the people get that. They want social care free at the point of use. Most of them think they have social care free at the point of use until you have a parent or you yourself, need social care. So I think people, if it's a conversation that says, we believe that there are things that we want to invest that becomes a core part of the social settlement, the things you should expect from this country, and we all chip in a little bit more for that to happen, I think people would get that. And I think there's a missed opportunity if we don't do that. So definitely a conversation about tax, but it's an easier conversation if you're talking about spending and investing in the long term. I think we've had this weird thing in our politics that one side says you can have it all without any taxation, and then the other side says you can have it, we don't want to tax, or if we do tax, we're trying to pay down the deficit. This just seems strange debate. So I think we need to find a way through that. But my desperate hope is that actually the budget is incomplete because the government hasn't done the long term. And as it does do the long term, it looks at the suite of taxes it can think about, everything from changing property taxes, business rates, council tax, through to thinking about how we structure income tax in order to pay for a different social settlement.
And moving on, and just a quick reminder to the audience, do pop in your questions. I've seen a few and weaving them in, but if you've got questions, do please let me know, and I can put them to the panelists. David Cork, picking up then, let's move on to the kind of long term. So that third objective that the Chancellor had. You mentioned corporation tax hike as the worst for impact on growth, potential impact on growth. Obviously, in terms of the kind of big measures, I mean, the super deduction, which David Smith, you mentioned, obviously is a big measure, and I think, you know, quite an exciting one, although we sort of raised the question of whether you really want to just constrain it to plant and machinery, or kind of you want to be a bit more creative about what you could also deduct. We obviously have free ports, which seems to be a perennial debate as to whether they will do loads or nothing at all, or simply move some pieces around the country, which might be, in your levelling up agenda, still a good thing. Where are we in terms of growth? Because the OBR's projection for growth at the kind of tail end of the forecasts is pretty woeful if we're actually trying to kind of rocket boost the economy. You know, we're talking 1.7, 1.6% growth back to, you know, where we were, which is fairly anemic. So what's your verdict on the growth section of the budget, and what more might need to be done?
Yeah, I think this is a weak area, I think, at the moment. In defence of the government, they've got a heck of a lot on their plate in terms of addressing the immediate challenge, and it's right to focus on that. But if I can pick up a perennial theme of David Smith's columns, which is productivity, and I don't think there is much there. And it's in that context that I do think that corporation tax as a tax is more damaging to productivity than pretty well any other tax you could care to mention. So that's why I think relying on, to a greater extent, on corporation tax in our public finances is a mistake. And I don't think there is a kind of clear vision as yet as to how does the UK post-Brexit, we no longer have the same access to our most important overseas market, how are we going to grow? How are we going to drive up those levels of productivity? We hear a lot of talk about levelling up, but it sometimes feels to me as levelling up is a slogan in search of a policy or a strategy. And I don't think it's there yet. I don't think they've got a clear idea of how that's going to work. I think free ports, yeah, I wish them well, but all the evidence tends to suggest it's just going to be about displacement, and it's just going to move things from one area to another. And to the extent that there is an economic philosophy that is emerging, it is much more interventionist, which some people will support. But there's much more of a sense of the government saying, well, you ought to be doing these things, and you ought to be doing them in these places. And I'm just not quite sure that what will drive the government's decisions to what those things are and where those things should be done is going to be driven by a great desire for putting the economy first, and economic thinking first, and focused laser-like on productivity. It's going to be much more political, and that the politics will always come ahead of the economics, as I dare I say it, has been the nature of the whole Brexit position. And I fear that in the long term, there isn't an answer that is being provided by this sort of new form of conservatism as to how do we make this economy more productive. I mean, the sort of traditional view of parties of all sorts since the 1980s is that you make us more productive by being more open, by making us attractive to inward investment, by having improved access to overseas markets, bringing down trade barriers. And I think there's a lot to be said for that model. But it seems to me that we're abandoning that without clearly having a replacement.
And David Smith, so on the theme of productivity, which seems to have stumped government after government in terms of what to do. Clearly, skills is a massive part of that agenda, and we've seen some decent investment, but as Miata said at the start, kind of some significant gaps or missed opportunities, perhaps. We did see a few targeted, what we called kind of productivity boosters in our kind of summary of the budget. So the super deduction, but with that point that it's only plant and machinery, and we know that technology is a big aspect of productivity. But also some of the initiatives around was it help to grow for small and medium enterprises, and kind of thinking about management skills and productivity boosting kind of technology and stuff like that. Is it enough, or is there other stuff that government should be doing? Because ultimately productivity is what gets you better growth and better living standards.
Yeah, no, productivity is key, and thank you, David, for mentioning the many columns I write about it. You know, and the OBR's projections for productivity are pretty anemic. You know, I think they have a 5-year average growth rate of productivity of 0.9%, and they, as always, they have a productivity improving at the end of the forecast period, and then it never quite does. And I think the solution to productivity is not complicated. You need more and better infrastructure. You need more business investment. You need better innovation, and you need more skills. You know, so 3 I's and an S. And there are little bits in the budget about that, but some of those, you know, the help to grow and so on, you know, reminded me a bit of that. I think a famous Ronald Reagan quote, you know, which is, you know, what are the most terrifying words you can hear? I'm from the government and I'm here to help you, you know. And it's so I think there's a bit of that there, a little bit of kind of Gordon Brown style tinkering. If you throw lots and lots of initiatives at small firms, you pretend they will all take notice of them. In fact, most of it washes over the heads of small businesses who are just trying to get on with things. You know, they have difficulty. So I think we're still lacking a productivity, a meaningful productivity agenda. I don't think it looks very good in the same week as the budget that the government, and in terms of levelling up, abolishes the Industrial Strategy Council, which I think was starting to do some quite good stuff under Andy Haldane. So that wasn't too good. And so I think that we still need some, in terms of free ports, essentially, and the Chancellor gave this away in his budget speech by acknowledging the one, I think, where there's one free port which has a very good argument, which is the Tees Valley one, the Tees Port one, because of the nature of what is done there. You know, a lot of processing industries there, perfect for a free port. But and I realise I'm offending lots of places elsewhere in the country, but the argument is much thinner anywhere else, and anywhere else it is, I think, as David says, a question of displacement. So I think we don't really have anything there to promote productivity growth in the medium and long term. And these things do take time. I mean, what we discover, even if you announce infrastructure, it takes a hell of a long time before that comes through and before it starts to make a difference. And that long time is beyond the timescale of most politicians. I mean, Rishi Sunak is young enough that he might benefit if he stays in politics, but most of the others don't. You know, so I think that is the challenge: doing the right things, but knowing they're not going to come to fruition for quite a few years.
I hope you haven't just jinxed him there by suggesting he might be able to do some long term and still be here. Miatta.
Probably have, yeah.
Well, we'll reconvene in a year's time and where we are. Miatta, one of the interesting questions I think about the growth, what a kind of agenda for growth would look like, is the role of public services in terms of enabling some of that. And we often talk about the more kind of, what I was called more kind of pure kind of economic intervention type ideas. But someone's put in the questions this point around kind of health inequalities. And, Andy Haldane's been very strong on saying that the health of the nation is part of the wealth of the nation. And, COVID has both sort of shone a light on and exacerbated many of the inequalities. So, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's skills, all of these things, if we are not good at those things, we're not going to have as good a growth. So there is a, human and social capital also contributes to economic and fiscal. Could you sort of share your thoughts on whether there are areas or things you would like to have seen in the budget that could be growth boosting, but are not necessarily tax cuts or incentives or whatever it might be?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, this is where the budget was weaker. And I think it was weaker not just in the sort of basic objective of how do you get the economy going again and how do you drive productivity, but how do you do that in a way that benefits the majority? And I'll come back to that second point in a second. And, you know, I hope the super deduction works. I mean, the OBR is pretty skeptical. They think all it will do is bring forward investment that would have happened anyway, so there'll be no additionality. And it will have negligible impacts on actual growth. So that's the big measure, and that's problematic. I think the focus on investment in infrastructure is key. Where we have fallen short is a combination of actually increasing the amount of private sector investment, but critically investment in people. So we know that both business, but also actually public investment in skills is woefully inadequate in this country. But I would add softer stuff, the stuff we call social capital, social infrastructure. We've been banging on about this. That package of stuff, whether that is support that people have in their communities that means that it's easier for them to engage in the labour market, is as important as the other stuff. The people side of productivity, I would argue, is the thing that we haven't got right. And we need to get that right alongside the hard kit, which we're still struggling on, but at least we have measures to address that. The other side of it, you know, the productivity debate is a really interesting dimension that's being opened up, which says there's supply side things, that's the stuff we think about, you know, innovation, infrastructure, skills. There's the demand side of things. And actually one of the reasons why companies haven't been investing enough and investing in their people is they've been worried about long-term demand in the economy. And so because of that, it's much better, for example, to hire people on short-term contracts. It's much better not to invest in them because you don't know if you're going to have to pull back what you do because you're not clear about demand in the economy. And there's a big part that can be played by government in terms of helping and stimulating and sustaining demand in the economy. So I think we need a holistic approach, and the decision to move back from industrial strategy, I think, is the wrong one. So this is definitely, for me, there's just a big hole on how we get to a different type of economy that the government, I think, is still trying to figure out. But even if you allow that free ports is amazing and it works, and the super deduction, you know, does more than the OBR is expecting it to do, and all of that yields growth. The last 10 years has shown us you can grow the economy, but that doesn't necessarily filter into people's lives being better. And that's because we've seen growth and wage stagnation. And if the OBR is right, we might see some incremental improvements in wage, but wages in 2026 are still below 2008 levels. And for me, that should be at the top of the intro for the government. So it's not just about boosting growth, but it's how do you do it in a way that ensures the benefits of that are spread across your population. And I don't think that there was absolutely nothing in the budget, incremental increase in the minimum wage, and I'll call the living wage. But beyond that, absolutely nothing that sought to address that central question. And for me, Build Back Better, that has to be at the heart of it. You cannot have 20 years in which living standards are stagnant and it's okay. It is absolutely not okay. So when the government says leveling up, when the government says Build Back Better, it's not just about growing the pie, it's about thinking how you grow it in a way that benefits everyone.
And David Gork, I mean, you mentioned leveling up being a slogan without really a plan, and you know, I think a lot of people have reflected on that. How, you know, what is missing and what could the government be doing that would enable, you know, those higher living standards, the kind of greater share of the pie going to those areas? Are the mechanisms that the Treasury are probably thinking about now, or should be thinking about now, that could help deliver greater sort of economic fairness, if you like, across the country and across groups?
What worries me a little bit about where we've got to is I think we've moved away from, if you like, the Northern Powerhouse objective, which was to say, or thinking, which is to say, look, we've got these mid-sized northern cities. They're not quite big enough to be the big employment markets that they need to be to get high levels of productivity. But if we can bring them together collectively, they are. And it was quite a city-focused strategy. And I think that's what you have to do, because if you want to drive up productivity, in the end, you've kind of got to have a critical mass of educated, skilled workers who are mobile enough to sort of work within this area. And what worries me a little bit is the strategy now seems a bit ad hoc and piecemeal. So we'll send some officials to Darlington and to Wolverhampton and to Leeds, and we'll do this bit there and that bit there, in the hope that sort of every part of the country has the same economic potential. And I think it's just going to spread things too thinly. And I think if you want to revive the economic prospects of the North and the Midlands, as we should, I think you've got to be more focused, and you've got to say, right, we want to make sure that Manchester and Leeds are going to be great successes, that the West Midlands can be a great success, and that some areas become, a little bit in the way that London operates, is that you've got a huge amount of economic activity in the centre of London, and this may change post-COVID, of course, but then you have got a large labour market that can come in and be part of that. And I slightly worry that we're wanting every town that elected a Conservative MP in 2019 for the first time is going to have a little bit of activity here and a little bit of activity there, and that's going to transform it. And I think some places will be successful if they are kind of really good places to live, but to the extent that you go into work, that'll be elsewhere. There's nothing wrong with being kind of part of a commuter belt, and actually the way that people will work, it will change, of course, but we've got to sort of focus on those places being really good places for skilled, educated people to live in. And I think that's where the focus should be. I think it's just a little bit too ad hoc, unstrategic, bitty.
Thank you. We've got about 3 minutes left, and there's loads of things that I could ask, but I will keep to time for people. I want to finish by the sort of, we have a section again in our sort of post-budget analysis, which is the kind of missing in action. So the thing we kind of felt really should have been in there, or that something should have been said about it that wasn't in the budget. I wonder if I can ask each of you, maybe something you've already mentioned, kind of, but if there's one thing that you really would have liked to have seen in the budget, an initiative, a measure, a tax, a cut, whatever it might be, what would be that one thing that you'd like to have seen Rishi Sunak have included? And maybe we can then do a plug for him including it in the spending review or the next budget. David Smith, can I start with you? Your missing in action measure or initiative?
Yeah, I think we've discussed most of them. I mean, one of them, obviously, and I can understand why they might keep this back for another occasion, is social care, which has long been promised. I mean, just to go back on the regional point. I mean, I've followed regional policy over many years. I've written books about it. I know how difficult it is, but I think and I agree very, very much with what David says about the piecemeal approach and giving every red wall Tory MP a little prize that he can put the equivalent of the 12-star EU badge on. Now we're not having any EU funding anymore, but I think it's quite easy to see a successful regional strategy based on innovation clusters around northern and Midland cities. But the challenge then becomes, you may make Sheffield a success, but what do you do for Barnsley? And I think that is that is the challenge. The smaller places in the North and Midlands, which may not benefit, even if the larger towns and cities are doing quite well. But social care is the one I'll mention, and I've probably used up my 1 minute there. So.
Perfect.
So Charlotte, take it away.
Thank you very much. Miata, you're missing in action, very briefly.
My brief one, something we'll be banging on about, a minimum income guarantee, an emergency measure just to weather the sort of economic storm for the next couple of years, £227 per week per person that needs it, with the view of trying to build in a minimum income floor within the social security system, which I hope it will be a long-term objective of the government.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And David Gork, you're missing in action.
It's coming back to what I was saying earlier. I'm still not sure that we've got the sort of the long-term plan for growth, to coin a phrase.
Long-term economic plan. Oh, what a note! What a note to end on. Yes, I can remember when I was in government in the coalition that was the only words we were allowed to utter. So let's bring that back. We'll start the campaign now. Long-term economic plan. Brilliant. Thank you so much to the three of you. It's been a genuinely really interesting and engaging conversation. I'm looking forward now, David Smith, to your recommendation to Rishi to give the equivalent of the EU badge now on everything. So hopefully we'll see a Rishi smile with some pink, italics on every town that gets something from the Levelling Up Fund. So thank you so much. That was brilliant. Great contributions. Thank you to all the people who are listening in. I know we've got quite a few people on the live stream, the team tells me. So hopefully everyone who has joined has also learned something or seen a different perspective or just generally enjoyed the conversation. I will wrap it up there, as I am conscious we are a minute over and we do try and keep things specifically to time. If you do want to get in touch with us, if you've got any thoughts or you want to share any feedback or anything, then contact us at Reform. Everyone who joined obviously has the events email, so let us know your thoughts. Otherwise, looking forward to seeing everyone. We've got Annalise Dodds in conversation the week after next, so do join us for that. Otherwise, everyone have a lovely weekend, and thank you again.